A man died in 1834, well-fed, comfortable, academically celebrated, and according to one compelling thesis, his math killed millions. Not directly, not with a weapon, but through an intellectual chain reaction that took nearly a century to detonate. Today, we're unpacking how Tomas Malthus shaped the academic trajectory that, in the author's argument, made the Holocaust not just possible, but, in a very real sense, inevitable. By the end of this episode, you'll understand what Malthus actually claimed, why the brightest minds of his era believed him without question, and how that belief cascaded through Karl Marx, through radical revolutionary circles, and eventually into the smoke-filled rooms where the 20th century's worst atrocities were planned. I want to bring in my co-host here, because this is one of those topics where the further you pull the thread, the more often it gets. So let's start at the beginning.
So Malthus was born into the Enlightenment, what the author of this thesis describes as a second Renaissance of sorts. And the key thing to understand about that moment is that Europe was, in a very real sense, waking up. 700 years of what the author calls Caesarean apartheid had kept European scholarship insular and limited. And now, suddenly, scholars had more accurate globes, a heliocentric model of the solar system, and a dawning realization that the planet was not, in fact, boundless as it had once been believed to be.
Right. So the world got smaller in their minds.
Exactly. And Malthus stepped into that moment and asked what the author frames as a genuinely terrifying question for its time. Precisely how many people could possibly fit on a planet as finite as Earth? He used algebra, the same mathematical framework that had been used to quantify optics, and applied it to population. And the answer he arrived at induced, in the author's words, an existential panic among Enlightenment scholars.
And what was the answer?
That we were all about to die of starvation. That's the conclusion Malthus reached. He observed and quantified what he saw as the logistical limits of our planetary system, and his verdict was essentially, the math doesn't work, we're running out of room, and famine is coming.
Okay, so I want to sit with that for a second, because from where we're standing today, that sounds almost absurd. When Malthus died in 1834, the search results note that Earth's population was estimated at around 700 million people. We're now at 8 billion, so he was spectacularly wrong.
Spectacularly wrong, yes. And the author makes that point very directly, that Malthus was clearly wrong on all accounts. But here's the thing that makes this story so interesting. Being wrong didn't stop him from being believed, and it didn't stop his ideas from doing enormous damage.
So why did people believe him? Like, what was the intellectual environment that made Malthus so persuasive?
A few things converged. First, church doctrine had been losing credibility. The author describes how existing church teachings had been found lacking in the proof department, so there was little incentive to push back on a scholar who came armed with algebra and demographic data. Second, and this is the part I find genuinely fascinating, the Bible itself had predicted that the end times would be inaugurated by widespread famine and disease. So Malthus wasn't contradicting religious expectation, he was, in a strange way, confirming it. He was just calculating a date certain.
Wait, so he was almost accidentally validating apocalyptic religious prophecy through secular math?
That's a really sharp way to put it. And that convergence, secular panic meeting religious expectation, created a kind of perfect storm of credibility for Malthus. Nobody had a strong reason to doubt him, and plenty of people had reasons, both scientific and theological, to believe him.
And the annual population growth rate at the time was just 0.1%, according to the search results, which, to us, sounds tiny. But the author says that was enough to convince Malthus that doom was imminent.
Right, and that tells you something important about the limits of the data available to him. He was working with what he had. The problem, as the author frames it, is that he presented his hypothesis as settled science rather than as a working theory subject to revision. And that's where the author locates the real failure, not in Malthus being wrong, but in academia's failure to maintain what the author calls the integrity of peer review.
So the argument is that the system failed, not just the man.
Exactly. And the author has this concept they call intellectual idolatry that I think is worth unpacking here because it's central to the whole thesis. The idea is that when scientists become more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, when they define themselves by what they believe rather than by what the evidence actually shows, that's a form of idolatry. And the author argues that every major catastrophe in this intellectual chain was driven by that same failure.
That's a striking framing, Because we usually think of idolatry as a religious problem, not a scientific one.
And that's precisely the author's point. They argue that everyone is, in some measure, both theologian and scientist, and therefore everyone is susceptible to this. When our justifications for what we believe are exposed as fallacies, we're hard-pressed to abandon those beliefs because we define ourselves too much by them. That's the human failure underneath the academic failure.
Okay, I want to dig into the chain reaction here because this is where it gets really dark. Malthus publishes his population thesis, the academic world accepts it as gospel, and then what? How does that lead to Karl Marx?
So, the author makes a very direct claim here. No single scholar contributed more to the theories of Karl Marx than Malthus. And the mechanism is actually pretty logical once you see it. If Malthus is correct, if the planet genuinely cannot sustain its population, then whoever controls resources controls life and death. And that means depriving any human being of their creature requirements is, in a very real sense, tantamount to murder.
Oh, that's a chilling logical step.
It is. And the author says that under the influence of this Malthusian framework and, the author notes, opium, murder is precisely what Karl Marx proclaimed the world's nobility, aristocracy, industrialist, and merchant classes were guilty of in the German ideology. They weren't just exploiting workers. In a Malthusian world, they were killing them by hoarding finite resources.
So Malthus essentially gave Marx the moral framework for violent revolution.
That's the author's argument, yes. Because of Malthus, Marx focused almost exclusively on what the author calls the creature requirements of human beings: food, shelter, survival. And once you frame the ruling class as murderers of the poor through resource hoarding, the case for violent overthrow becomes, in that worldview, not just justified, but morally necessary.
And this is where I think the author's thesis gets genuinely provocative, because they're not just saying Malthus influenced Marx, they're saying this chain of influence is what made the Holocaust, in their word, inevitable. That's a strong claim.
It is a strong claim, and the author is upfront that this is a thesis, not a comprehensive historical study. But the chain they're tracing is real and documented. The author describes what they call 13 epiphanic thresholds in human history, and each one, from Galileo's telescope to Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope to Pasteur's germ theory, created what they call cognitive dissonance among the intelligentsia, which then produced social upheaval and human rights violations. And with each threshold, the severity of the upheaval grew worse.
It's almost like a ratchet mechanism, right? Each click of the gear makes the next one harder to reverse.
That's actually the author's exact metaphor. They describe it as a ratcheting mechanism where the consequences of each epiphany grow worse. And the Malthus moment is one of the most critical clicks in that ratchet, because it's the one that gave the intellectual left a scientific justification for class warfare.
Let's talk about the 1905 moment, because the author flags that as a kind of point of no return. What happened in 1905?
So 1905 is when the proof became definitive that diseases were not punishments from God, but the biological consequences of pathogens. And the author says that at this juncture, the divorce between religion and science became final. From 1905 forward, science would reign supreme among the world's intelligentsia. And the author argues there was no way to stop the Holocaust after that point.
Why? Why does that specific moment make it irreversible?
Because the last institutional check on radical scientific claims, religious authority, had been definitively discredited. The author describes how, sensing academia's encroachment, Mary Baker Eddy had tried to reframe religion itself as a scientific process, essentially trying to compete on science's own terms. But once germ theory was proven, that bridge collapsed. And without any counterweight, the author argues, pseudoscience could now run completely unchecked.
And the author makes a really pointed distinction here between actual empirical science and what they call pseudoscience, because not everything being published under the banner of science at that time was actually following the scientific method.
Right, and that's a crucial distinction. The author says that from 1905 forward, the few who were following empirical method were outpaced by those who published pseudoscience in what they describe as an orgy of intellectual ambition. So you had this environment where the prestige of science was at an all-time high, but the rigor of science was not keeping pace. That's a dangerous combination.
Okay, so now we get to the scene that I think is the most cinematic moment in this whole thesis. Café Central in Vienna, 1910. Walk me through what the author describes happening there.
So the author describes traveling, metaphorically, to the Café Central in Vienna in 1910. And what they find there is extraordinary. In a thick cloud of opium smoke, a group of intellectuals are gathered. Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, Dmitry Mitrinovich, and Vladimir Lenin, the author notes, in absentia. These are the people who are about to reshape the 20th century.
Wait, Trotsky, Stalin, and Adler were all in the same cafe?
According to the author's account, yes. And what they were doing there was planning. The author says this clique of, in their words, chin-scratchers evolved into what they called the proletariat, which the author describes as the first and only species of hominid in history to be defined by science. Except, the author is very clear, it wasn't science. It was, in their word, insanity.
And what were they planning specifically?
A global war of extinction. The author says the revolution they agreed upon had to be sudden, violent, and catalytic. In the planned conflagration, the world's royalty, nobility, aristocracy, and bourgeoisie would be eliminated in one fell swoop. And the author's point is that this plan was framed as extremely scientific, grounded in the Malthusian logic that these classes were murderers of the poor, and in the Darwinian logic of survival of the fittest applied to social classes.
And then there's the detail about the person sitting at the table across the room.
Yes. The author describes a loner named Adolf on the periphery of this coffee klatch, soaking it all in from a table across the room and beginning to make plans of his own. The author doesn't elaborate extensively on that detail, but the implication is clear. The same intellectual environment that produced Bolshevism also incubated what would become National Socialism. Two different conclusions drawn from the same poisoned well of pseudoscientific thought.
That's a genuinely unsettling image. And it connects to something the author says that I think deserves more attention, that accredited academia has, in their words, boogeymaned Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Workers' Party, in part to obscure the role the academic community itself played in the world's first war of extinction.
That's one of the most provocative claims in the whole thesis, and it's worth being clear that this is the author's argument, not an established historical consensus. But the logic they're presenting is that by focusing all blame on Hitler as an individual monster, we avoid asking the harder question, what intellectual conditions made his rise possible? And the author's answer is that those conditions were built, brick, by mainstream academia over the course of a century.
And Malthus is the first brick.
Malthus is the first brick in this particular part of the wall, yes. The author traces the whole chain back further to Ibn Sal's optical lens. But in terms of the social and political catastrophe of the 20th century, Malthus is the critical turning point, because he's the one who introduced the idea that the planet's resources are finite and that human survival is a zero-sum competition. Once that idea is in the intellectual bloodstream, it doesn't leave.
And the author makes the point that neo-Malthusians are still with us today. The doom and scarcity framework didn't die with Malthus or even with the 20th century's catastrophes.
Right. The author says that neo-Marxists remain convinced Malthus was a man ahead of his time, that doom is just around the corner, and that the harvest's delayed demise is only attributable to the fossil fuel industry, which, according to what the author calls equally dubious mathematics, is about to be exhausted. The author is pretty pointed in saying that extremist and alarmist movements in accredited academia are not new, are grounded in fuzzy mathematics, and are always proven wrong within decades. But they can do extraordinary damage in a small window of time.
That's the part that really sticks with me. The damage doesn't require the theory to be correct. The damage happens while people believe it.
Exactly. And that's the author's core warning. The panic that Malthus set off among leading scholars, Karl Marx among them, forms what the author calls the existential angst behind every Malthusian crisis that has reared its head since 1848. And the author specifically says that a Malthusian crisis which occurred in 1918 provided the moral high ground seized by the National Socialist Workers' Party and justified the extremes and extent of the socialist holocausts of the 20th century.
So the 1918 crisis is the spark the author mentions at the end of their thesis.
The author calls it the spark, yes. They say that by the time the founders of the 20th century's socialist movement met at Café Central in Vienna, the march toward the Holocaust was nearly complete. All that was needed was that spark, and the 1918 crisis, which the author says they'll document in a subsequent series, provided it.
I want to go back to the peer review argument for a moment, because I think it's the most actionable part of this thesis. The author isn't just saying bad things happened, they're diagnosing a mechanism. What exactly is the failure they're identifying?
The author diagnoses it as a consistent failure of accredited academia to maintain the integrity of peer review. The result is that hypothesis gets presented to the general public as science instead of as mere hypothesis. And the author says that failures in peer review cannot fully explain the dissonance at epiphanic moments, but idolatry can. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that is, in the author's framing, a form of idolatry.
And the same applies to theologians, right? The author is even-handed about this.
Very much so. The author says, when theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of Scripture than to manifest truth, that is also a form of idolatry. And since everyone is, in some measure, both theologian and scientist, we are all susceptible. The author says accepting that is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome. But it must be done.
There's something almost hopeful in that framing, even in the middle of such a dark thesis. The problem isn't that humans are evil, it's that we're all prone to a very specific kind of intellectual self-deception.
And the author's point is that every major religion and the peer review process of science both enforce the same lesson. We are our own worst counsel. The tragedy is that it took the Holocaust to make that lesson undeniable. And even then, the author implies, we haven't fully learned it.
Let me push back on one thing here, because I think a fair listener would ask, isn't this thesis doing something similar to what it's criticizing? It's tracing a very clean line from Malthus to the Holocaust, which is itself a kind of grand narrative that might be oversimplifying enormously complex historical forces.
That's a fair challenge, and I think the author would actually welcome it. They're explicit that this is not a comprehensive study. It's a thesis, a provocation, a way of charting one particular thread through history. The author isn't claiming this is the only explanation for the Holocaust. They're claiming it's an explanation that academia has been reluctant to examine because it implicates academia itself.
Which is itself a form of the intellectual idolatry they're diagnosing.
Precisely. If academia is too invested in the narrative of Hitler as a singular monster to examine its own role in creating the conditions for his rise, that's exactly the kind of hypothesis over truth devotion the author is warning against. The thesis is almost self-referential in that way.
Okay, I also want to touch on the tangent about Ibn Sal's lens, because the author traces everything, and I mean everything, back to this single invention. That's a fascinating way to structure a historical argument.
It is. The author's point is that the optical lens was the first tool that allowed humans to see beyond the limits of the naked eye, both into the cosmos through Galileo's telescope and into the microscopic world through Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope. And each of those revelations shattered existing paradigms and created the cognitive dissonance that the author says drives social upheaval. Malthus used the same algebraic framework that Ibn Sal used to quantify optics, just applied to population instead of light.
So, the same mathematical tools that let us see the universe more clearly also let us construct elaborate, confident, and sometimes catastrophically wrong theories about human society.
That's a really elegant way to put it. The tools are neutral. The idolatry is in how we use them, and more specifically, in how quickly we mistake a powerful tool for a source of absolute truth.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, Malthus and his population panic, the way it fed into Marx's moral framework for revolution, the 1905 divorce between religion and science, the gathering at Café Central in 1910, what does the author want us to take away from all of this?
I think the author wants us to take away something genuinely uncomfortable. That the Holocaust was not an aberration produced by one uniquely evil man. It was the culmination of a century-long intellectual failure, a failure to distinguish between hypothesis and proven science, a failure to maintain rigorous peer review, and a failure to recognize when devotion to an idea had crossed into the kind of idolatry that makes atrocity feel not just justified, but scientifically necessary.
And the actionable insight is that this pattern is not unique to the 19th and 20th centuries. The author is very clear that extremist and alarmist movements in accredited academia are not new and are always proven wrong within decades, but they can do extraordinary damage in that window.
Right. And the author's implicit challenge to us is to ask, what ideas are we treating as settled science today that are actually hypothesis? What intellectual idols are we so devoted to that we can't see the evidence against them? Because if the pattern holds, the cost of getting that wrong is not just academic embarrassment. History suggests the cost is measured in human lives.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. Malthus wasn't a villain. He was a scholar doing what scholars do, observing the world, running the numbers, and publishing his conclusions. The tragedy is that the system around him failed to do its job. Nobody pushed back hard enough. Nobody insisted that a hypothesis remain a hypothesis until it was proven. And in that gap between hypothesis and accepted truth, an entire intellectual architecture was built, one that Marx, Darwin, and eventually the planners at Café Central in Vienna all moved into and made their home.
And the author's point is that the righteous did try to push back. They describe figures like James Oglethorpe and his plan for the American colonies, and they describe the American Civil War as the world's first war against pseudoscience. The first time people fought and died to reject the idea that human beings could be scientifically classified as lesser. And Ulysses S. Grant created the public education system specifically to stop this march in its tracks. But it wasn't enough. The march continued.
Which makes the author's thesis not just a historical argument, but a warning. The same failure mode is always available to us. The same ratchet is always there, waiting to click forward.
And the only thing that stops it, the author argues, is the thing that every major religion and rigorous peer review both demand: the humility to accept that we are our own worst counsel, that what we believe most passionately may be the thing most in need of scrutiny.
Remember how we started. A man who died well-fed in 1834, celebrated by his peers, convinced he had done the math correctly. Tomas Malthus never saw the world he helped create. He never saw the Café Central in Vienna, never saw the revolutions his ideas helped justify, never saw the Holocaust that this author argues his intellectual legacy helped make inevitable. He just did the math, got it catastrophically wrong, and the world believed him anyway. That's the part that should keep us up at night. Not the monsters of history, but the confident, credentialed, well-meaning scholars who handed them their justifications.